Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Ken. North Korea's military parade indicated that the country now has a greater ability to threaten the US and South Korea as the regime showed up ranging from a new large intercontinental ballistic missile to an arsenal of conventional weapons. Following the event, South Korea's National Security Advisor and Defense Minister visited Washington at the same time this week, drawing attention as to what the two allies may have discussed. We'll talk about these and more. Joining us today is Ian Williams, Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Williams is also the Managing Editor of the CSIS website Missile Threat, which carries analysis on missile proliferation and missile defense systems. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He is a Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Young.
Thank you.
While South Korea's Defense Minister Seo Wook was in an annual meeting in Washington, D.C. with his counterpart, U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, South Korea's National Security Advisor Seo Hoon made an unannounced visit to Washington, stirring much curiosity among the watchers. We'll touch more on this later in the show, but first, we'll have to get into the details of North Korea's military parade. North Korea unveiled a new intercontinental missile and submarine-launched ballistic missile. Mr. Williams, how advanced are they? How different are they from the previously known?
Well, they share some similarities. If you look at, for example, the new ICBM, it probably uses the same kind of engine as the Hwasong-15, which was the previous ICBM that North Korea tested in 2017, but on a much larger scale. So it is in some ways an enlarged version of that previous ICBM. And what they can do with this extra space is have a heavier payload, or they can possibly put multiple warheads on one of the missiles. So this in some ways makes the missile a bit more dangerous. It does come with some drawbacks, though. This larger missile is much easier to see from the air and from space. So if you're able to disable that missile, then it costs in some ways North Korean strike capability more. In terms of the new submarine-launched ballistic missile, it's a little bit, this is a more mysterious. We weren't expecting to see a new submarine-launched ballistic missile. It doesn't appear to be much larger than North Korea's previously tested submarine-launched ballistic missiles, but they can only go so large because you still have to fit them on a submarine. But some observers have noted that it looks like it's possibly made of a lighter material, which means that they can possibly get greater range from it.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, what were your overall thoughts?
Well, let me just add that the new ICBM, we saw a new model transporter erector launcher with 11 axles. And this is very interesting because people want to know where it came from. Did it come from China, or was it indigenously manufactured? And if it was indigenously manufactured, then that does represent a rather significant step forward in terms of being able to evade sanctions. Also, I would say that North Korea upgraded its equipment for the parade across the board, including in terms of individual artillery and uniforms, and basically looks like a better equipped force than what we've seen in the past.
Mm-hmm. And North Korea also presented its version of Russia's Iskander short-range ballistic missile and super-large multiple rocket launchers. Mr. Williams, are these the ones North Korea test-launched several times since 2019?
Yes, they were, and it was what really struck me about their display of these particular missiles is that particularly of the KN-25, the so-called super large multiple launch rocket system. We saw them display these on several different types of vehicles in several different kinds of configurations. We saw them deployed on wheeled vehicles that can move very quickly over roads. We saw them deployed on tracked vehicles that can move off-road in more rugged terrain. So that kind of signals to me that they really have embraced this, particularly the KN-25, and are looking to be able to incorporate it in a broad way across their military.
Just a follow-up question, Mr. Williams. What was the most surprising aspect during the military parade?
In some ways, I was a little bit surprised that it was, it's a much more incremental step, this new ICBM. I was expecting the way that North Korea was talking about a new strategic system. I was expecting something a little more, a bigger leap. Something like a solid fuel ICBM that can be launched with, very little preparation time. So, an incremental advancement of their liquid fuel capabilities was, was a little more incremental than I guess I expected. But also something that surprised me was that we didn't see any of the older North Korean missiles that you typically see paraded, right? We didn't see the Musadong, right? We did not see the Nodong, right? These all have been kind of the mainstays of North Korean missile capabilities for a long time. We really only saw missiles that have been developed under the regime of Kim Jong-un, which was interesting. So I think it's something that perhaps the Kim Jong-un has really taken a personal ownership of the North Korean missile development.
Mr. Snyder, we all know that North Korea's economy is broken. Do they even have money to continue doing this? I mean, where in the world does the money come from?
Well, they clearly have the money to put on a nice parade and to develop some new capabilities. And I think the money is probably coming from off-the-books transactions. So in this case, looking at mirror statistics, which is a common method for trying to understand North Korea's economy, is not going to work. It probably is coming from illicit foreign currency earnings, possibly from cyber activities and from other exchanges that are simply beyond the purview of recorded trade.
Obviously, sanctions on North Korea don't seem to be working. And during the event, Kim Jong-un didn't mention the US in his speech. Some analyze it was putting silent pressure, and others say North Korea was signaling that it is hoping for a resumption of dialogue in the event that President Donald Trump gets reelected. Mr. Snyder, what do you think?
Well, I would argue that the message that North Korea was delivering was intended to be useful regardless of who wins the election. And that is that North Korea is a de facto entrenched nuclear-capable state. And Kim Jong-un even seems to repeat messages that go back to the Seventh Party Congress in 2016, trying to project North Korea as a responsible nuclear state. And I think that the message basically is we've arrived as a nuclear state and you're going to have to live with it regardless of who wins the election.
This week, two of South Korea's high-ranking officials visited Washington, D.C. South Korea's Minister of Defense, Seo came here for the annual defense meeting with U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper. But the visit by South Korea's Presidential National Security Advisor, Seo was not expected. And of course, Mr. Seo is known for brokering North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's invitation to Mr. Trump for the first U.S.-North Korean summit. Mr. Snyder, why do you think he was here?
Well, it's interesting because his visit actually reminds me to some degree of 2017, where we saw President Moon give a speech in July of 2017 in Berlin that laid out a strategy for inter-Korean engagement. And then subsequently they worked on that strategy. And it paid off because Kim Jong-un changed his direction and embraced diplomacy in 2018. And so we just saw President Moon give a similar speech at the UN General Assembly, focused on trying to achieve a peace declaration. And so I think that Sahun was engaged in trying to win U.S. support for a peace declaration and to try to figure out how to incorporate that as part of a U.S.-South Korea combined strategy. And of course, it was also based on inter-Korean communications of recent weeks, including letters between Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in. And so I think they're trying to push forward that strategy, and we'll have to see how it unfolds.
So what you're saying is that this might have to do with South Korean President Moon Jae-in's continued call for an end-of-war declaration. In that case, was South Korea trying to persuade the U.S. to take a different approach on this just before the U.S. presidential election?
I think that the strategy is focused on trying to win U.S. support for an end-of-war declaration, and I think that the outcome was consistent with what the Trump administration had signaled earlier: openness to a declaration, but with certain conditions, namely the link between an end-of-war declaration and denuclearization.
The U.S. and South Korea held a Security Consultative Meeting, SCM, the annual talks between the defense chiefs of the two countries in Washington, D.C. this week. The U.S. reaffirmed its commitment to South Korea's security, including providing extended deterrence, saying the two countries' alliance has remained the linchpin for the regional security. What kind of deterrence can and should the U.S. provide with, Mr. Williams?
The kind of commitment that we have to South Korea is needs to be on the same level of that we have with NATO, in a sense that an attack on South Korea is kind of viewed as an attack on the United States. Now, we have a lot of U.S. troops on the peninsula, which in some ways almost ensures that the U.S. will be involved in any military contingency between the North and the South. So I think there is a commitment of conventional military, but given the nuclear dimension of the North Korean threat, there needs to be a strong commitment of also a U.S. nuclear umbrella over South Korea, and I think this is important to kind of assure South Korea that it doesn't need to pursue its own nuclear capability. Bringing back some older nuclear capabilities that allow it to use lower yield nuclear weapons, things like the sea-launched cruise missile or the low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile that the U.S. has just deployed. This allows the U.S. to make a much more credible nuclear commitment. Now, this is not to say that the United States would automatically respond to a nuclear attack by North Korea with a nuclear weapon, but I think it's important that for deterrence that option is on the table and that option is credible and backed with appropriate capabilities.
And Mr. Snyder, your assessment on this?
Well, I saw a lot in the SCM that went back to ongoing work with regards to sending messages of credibility about extended deterrence, joint policy committees that have been in operation were cited, tailored deterrence strategy. And so I think that, the work of shoring up the credibility of extended deterrence is constant and ongoing. And the SCM did its usual task in terms of trying to address that issue.
And my last question is for Mr. Williams. What areas should South Korea improve in its defense based on what we witnessed during the parade?
In some of these shorter range mass rocket and artillery attacks, there is really no active defense against these other than counterattack. One area that, for civil defense that South Korea could look at is some kind of, what we call counter-rocket artillery and mortar capabilities, things similar to the Israeli Iron Dome. That's one area that they could look at to provide Seoul with some a better defense. But more broadly, South Korea made a limitation, a self-imposed limitation in response to China's concern over the U.S. THAAD deployment to South Korea, in which South Korea declared that it would not integrate its missile defense systems with that of the United States. I think that was an easy concession to give at the time, but now that we're looking at North Korea deploying capabilities like KN-23, KN-25, these missiles fly very low, and they can be launched with very little warning because they're solid fueled. And this means that radars that are shorter range are not going to be able to see them until very late. And this is not a good situation for missile defense. You want to be able to pick these up much further. And now the United States has been successfully testing integration of THAAD and Patriot, where Patriot missiles can fire off of the radars of a THAAD radar. And this allows a much earlier detection of these missiles and the use of a much greater range of the Patriot missiles. So, I think there is a lot to be gained now by South Korea integrating more closely with United States missile defense. So I think that is another area that South Korea should consider revisiting.
After Pyongyang unveiled previously unseen missiles, U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper said North Korea's nuclear and missile programs pose a global threat. He made it clear that the United States remains committed to the security of South Korea. He reiterated, however, that the U.S. and South Korea must find a more equitable way of sharing defense costs, suggesting the two allies still need to work on narrowing their differences. Mr. Williams and Mr. Snyder, thank you both very much. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Young.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.